I was in New Zealand, and it was my 50th birthday, and I went all the way to New Zealand because I really hate birthday parties. I don't like the attention. So much can change in 3 years, it's incredible. So we went to New Zealand. We'd had this trip planned for a while, but a few months before we got there, I'd been made redundant for the 3rd time in 5 years. And I knew as much as I wanted to set myself up in business as a coach and an emotional freedom technique practitioner, but that's kind of all that I knew. I didn't really know what direction I was going to go in, and I've had a lot of false starts in terms of where I was going to go. And then I met this incredible woman here, so I'm going to get emotional. This lovely woman here called Laura Lucas, who's come all the way from Dundee to be here today. And I first saw her, and I was looking for something different. I knew I needed a bit of help and guidance in terms of where I was going, but I didn't want a regular business coach. Those kind of people who talked about strategy and whatnot just left me feeling really cold. And here was this lovely lady who called herself a soul coach and taught a practice called Divine Alchemy. And when I started working with her, I cleared so many of those last layers of shame that I was hanging around with in relation to my mental health diagnosis. And because I'd been through this journey of healing myself, and I thought that I'd got to a point where, it wasn't an issue anymore, that I dealt with it, but I was still carrying so much shame around being diagnosed as having borderline personality disorder, because anyone who has worked in mental health knows that that diagnosis usually comes with a, oh God. So I kind of hid that diagnosis and freely admitted that I'd struggled with depression or addictions because that was so much more socially acceptable. But when I released the shame and I started to talk more openly about it, something changed in my business, and I started to attract the right kind of people to work with me. And then at the beginning of this year, I just felt really called to write a book, to start sharing my story, because there were so many people that I met at this exhibition at the Best You Expo earlier this year who really connected to my story and just went out of their way to thank me for sharing, for being so honest, that they needed to hear that, they needed to know that they weren't alone. My first attempt to write the parts of my story, I shared it in a Facebook group, a closed Facebook group, and something quite amazing happened. Not only did I get incredible feedback from the people in the group, but I was also completely and utterly floored with waking up one morning and not being able to move. My back had locked and seized. And I think it was the experience of my body just freaking out at me being so vocal about some of my past stories. So with the help of lovely Bex there and I think my brother out there, they both sent me some distance healing. And I went from being crippled to being able to get up and walk around within an hour because of their healing. I thought I was going to give up the idea of writing a book there and then because I thought it's not worth putting myself through that. But a couple of months went by and something else happened, and I just knew that actually it's not about me. I have to share my story. I'm being called to do this. So I thought I would just read an extract from the book. Go on.
You want me to hold it?
No, so I'm sure I'll be able to find it. So the monsters under my bed were all the, should we say, the less helpful emotions that I didn't want to experience growing up, and I didn't want to acknowledge them, because if I acknowledged the monsters under my bed, I had to acknowledge the reality of my childhood. And I went through most of my childhood years and early adult years pretending that the abuse I experienced didn't happen. So I merrily ignored those monsters under my bed, and the problem was that they had a voice, they needed to be heard, and the more that I ignored them, the bigger they got, until there wasn't enough drugs, there wasn't enough alcohol, there wasn't enough, sorry kids, there wasn't enough inappropriate sex that I could have. I'm really cringing, sorry. That would actually take the pain away.
Mothers, eh?
So I ended up having a massive breakdown. And it was really the start of my healing process. It was the first time, I guess, that my soul was coming out and saying, we need to do something about this. We need to be heard. And I didn't know that at the time. I just thought that I was going through life and I was just very angry and very sad and very emotional. Anyway, I shall read you one of an extract from the book. One of the monsters is called Dissociation. And dissociation is a distant cousin of fear. And this is what dissociation has to say about me, because it's the monsters telling my story, not me. So remember at the beginning how my cousin Fear abandoned Jane as a child because he didn't want to crush this beautiful little soul. Well, one of the techniques that I taught her in order to escape feeling our family's presence or any of the other monsters was disassociation. She was really tiny the first time I showed her how to do this. I felt quite proud of myself actually. But the problem was she became a bit too good at it, if you know what I mean. This is Jane's account of what it was like. I was a stranger in my own body. I always felt different, like I didn't belong or fit anywhere. A stranger in my life and a stranger in my body. I realise now that the strange feeling came from living my life outside of my body. I know that that sounds really weird, but let me try and explain. The very first time that I was aware I could escape from my body was when I was about 3 or 4 years old. I was sick again with a high temperature, and I remember looking at myself from the ceiling. I was floating in the corner of the room, looking down on my sick body in bed. Wow, this was really fun, especially as out of my body I felt nothing. Only lightness and a mild interest in what I was observing. And I learnt how to master this skill so that every time the bad stuff happened, I would float out of my body and watch from above. Sometimes I wouldn't even hang around to watch. I would go off to the park and watch the other kids play or go into the safety of my brother or sister's room. I have no memory of how often the bad stuff happened, because for the most part, I wasn't there. All I know was that my body responded to the bad stuff with bouts of cystitis and kidney infections. And I do remember constantly having to take the yucky medicine. No wonder that I grew up feeling like I didn't belong, a stranger in my own body, because I was so rarely there. And then it started to happen again when I was grown up. That weird trippy thing that I used to do as a kid. I was standing on a platform at Highgate Station. There was someone looking very suspicious. I can't remember what he was doing to raise my suspicions, but before I knew it, I was floating on the ceiling of the tube station, looking down, just watching. I saw myself get onto the tube and watched it pull away. I came to just as they announced that we had reached the end of the line. I smiled, thanking the announcer for his unwittingly words of wisdom. it was time to do something about this before it got me into trouble. My next session with the psychiatrist, I mentioned what was happening. He sat listening with fascination and explained that without the mask of drugs and alcohol, my body was responding to the fear stimuli in the way it had as a small child. Yeah, all very interesting. But just tell me how I can stop it. I was then passed on to a community psychiatric nurse who taught me breathing exercises and a very neat trick of keeping an elastic band on my wrist to snap every time I felt myself start to dissociate. And that was the technical term for these out-of-body experiences, apparently. As simple as it worked for the most part and was very discreet. The only time that it raised eyebrows was when I was having sex and snapping this elastic band like a crazy person to stay connected to my body. I think I explained it away as a delaying a pleasure tactic. Within a matter of months, I was back in the body 100% of the time, and well, this really sucked. Now I had to deal with all those monsters that were coming out from under the bed, and I had absolutely nothing to stop me from feeling. Thank you, and I do apologise to my husband because I haven't shared any of that stuff with him. Sorry, I'm really sorry. So
It's too late.
I know, too late. So that was just an extract from the book, and each chapter is related to one of the monsters, and they share their reflection, because the thing is, although it looked like and it felt like they were very destructive in my life, they had a role to play, they had a reason for being, and my process was in learning each of their valuable role that they had for me. Now, one thing that I have forgotten to mention is that 5% of all the profits from the sale of this book and future books, because there are going to be quite a few, I think, is going to be supporting a foundation that I'm going to be putting together to introduce emotional freedom technique into schools, because if there's one thing that I have learned from the clients that I've worked with and from my life as well, is that children need techniques to be able to manage their emotions, and using emotional freedom technique is a really, really simple way of teaching children how to manage their emotions and how to manage stress. So I'm going to be working with the lovely Fiona over there, who has had some experience of working with children, and together we are going to do some amazing work. And because I was successful in crowdfunding most of, all of the money in terms of that I've laid out for the book, every sale that I make now, the profits are going towards setting up this foundation, so it's going to start happening very soon, so it's very exciting. So please feel free to purchase any of the last books that are there, and don't forget, if you're the person who has the highlighted pink About Me section, then that means you've won a day retreat with me. And come and see me, and we can arrange when we can make that happen. I think that's it. So just enjoy yourselves, enjoy me.